Hugh Hewitt. Mike Gallagher is chairman of the new House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. He's, of course, a congressman from Wisconsin. Good morning, Congressman Gallagher. I want to talk about the State of the Union. Last night I was with your friend, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and we spent a great deal of time talking about Xi watching the State of the Union and what he must have thought. As you sat there, what did you think of our Chinese adversaries watching the president?
Well, obviously our energy policy is incoherent, and I'm sure that hasn't been lost on the Chinese Communist Party. And besides fearing their own people, one of the things they fear the most is their lack of energy resources. So it's a massive own goal on our part to have this counterproductive war against domestic energy production. And so the president's remark about we're going to need oil and gas for the future, near future, but then basically I'm going to put you all out of business after that drew a bunch of derision because it just highlights the incoherence of our approach. And so that's one thing. The other thing I was struck by, I think, was a massive missed opportunity really to harness the Chinese spy balloon incident as sort of a Sputnik moment to generate action, to create a bipartisan sense of urgency around countering the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Instead, he seemed to sort of barely devote enough of his speech to the CCP, fail to sort of talk about the nature of the CCP, and fail to identify clear ways in which we can better defend our sovereignty. So that was a massive missed opportunity, to say nothing of just the complete misinformation on Republicans wanting to touch Social Security and Medicare. I mean, that was beyond the pale. That was crazy.
I think he may have underestimated the reaction of the American public because he got applause lines from the Democrats who are just a little unhinged. Let me play the line you referred to because I've identified it as the takeaway, the meme we will remember. It will become Kevin McCarthy's faith is priceless, by the way. Cut number 26, the president last night.
Production. And when I talk to a couple of them, they say, we're afraid you're going to shut down all the oil wells and all the oil refineries anyway, so why should we invest in them? I said, we're going to need oil for at least another decade. And that's going to exceed and beyond that.
So Kevin McCarthy says you can watch it in real time. He kind of says, what did he say? And then he starts to laugh with the rest. Did the Democrats laugh too? We're going to need oil for another 10 years. We're going to need oil for another 1,000 years. What was he thinking?
I wonder if that was in the script or that was a classic Joe Biden ad lib right there, because it obviously made absolutely no sense. Listen, you want the State of the Union to be, a serious, sober affair. Usually there's not a lot of laughter that happens, but I think some Democrats probably couldn't help themselves and were at least suppressing giggles, if nothing else.
Well, the guy is, unfortunately, as I said in the pre-show on the Salem News Channel, he's got a 50-year-old addict that he rummages through in his Washington, D.C. memories, and he comes up with his greatest hits. It's like me humming Dylan or Baez records from my college days. Congressman Gallagher, I did talk to Secretary Pompeo last night, and I talked to Ambassador O'Brien yesterday by phone. Both of them confirmed for me they were never briefed on any Chinese surveillance. Secretary Pompeo expanded in the live audience before the Nixon Library on the fact that this is an enormous array of sensitive material that we did not bring down over Montana. Your colleague Ryan Zinke said they could have brought it down over Petroleum County, Montana, where there are fewer people living than there are members of Congress. It could have been done. What do you think was their thinking? Or were they not thinking at all? Were they paralyzed, like so much of the Biden administration has been, by rapidly developing stories and a very young staff?
Well, I kind of think, and I have not yet confirmed this, that they thought, were it not for the pesky intervention of the Billings Gazette and some civilians in Montana who were looking at the sky, that they could get away with it, that they could let the balloon traverse the United States, lazily drift over sensitive nuclear facilities, and not do anything about it, and so as to facilitate Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's trip to China. So my working hypothesis is they wanted to suppress it because they wanted this trip to go forward, because they're seeking to adopt a more cooperative approach to China, and some in the administration believe this Chinese Communist Party charm offensive. Now, perhaps there's a more mundane excuse for what happened, which is that we simply didn't detect it in time to do anything about it, or despite having previous incidents, we don't have a well-developed standard operating procedure. But I think the thing most people have been pointing out that's quite right is that if the concern was about debris or civilians on the ground, the time to take it out was when it was over the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And that makes no sense to me. Finally, I'd say, Hugh, you brought up this issue that Robert has talked about on TV, that Secretary Pompeo has talked about on TV, which is that, early on when this crisis was unfolding, the Biden administration was quick to point out that this has happened multiple times in the Trump administration, as if to downplay it, by the way. That was it was an anonymous Pentagon official that said this originally. Well, if it happened multiple times in the Trump administration and our highest level civilian leaders, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense, weren't aware of it, weren't briefed on it, that's incredibly problematic. Or if they weren't briefed on it because we didn't piece together that this had happened until after the fact, and we reverse engineered the flight path, that's also problematic because it suggests our ability to detect these things, our early warning system, our NORAD system, is not up to snuff. Finally, and I'm sorry to go on here, Hugh, there seem to be a lot of people downplaying the actual value of this intelligence collection asset, saying it couldn't provide anything you couldn't buy for $10 via commercial imagery. Well, why are we so sanguine about that? Why are we confident that the PLA wouldn't weaponize something like this in the future? There was a Financial Times report that suggested in 2018 there was a balloon identical to this from which they were deploying missiles, and that the PLA rocket force has already incorporated the use of these high-altitude balloons into their doctrine as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets that will cue targets that they can action kinetically forward. So it was a ton of inconsistencies coming out of the Biden administration. And ultimately, I think it just should hammer home the point to the American people that when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, this isn't an over there problem. It's a right here.
I want to emphasize the administration has adopted the time-honored approach of trial lawyers. It's not my dog. It didn't bite you. Besides, you kicked him first. And they've added, what dog? They've added, there is no dog. And in fact, what Secretary Pompeo said last night, there is immeasurable value to signals intelligence that are not satellite images. Satellite images are static pictures. Signals intelligence is a sweep of electronic communications and all other kind of activity on the ground in real time. Can you imagine what this would look like should, God forbid, there be a conflict with China? Imagine if Japan had transited Pearl Harbor in 1940, leisurely taking pictures of where our battleships and carriers were. We would have noticed that, right? I just can't believe that the president did not bring it up last night. Were you expecting him to at least mention it?
I was. And I said on TV earlier in the day that I really think he had an opportunity to use it as a wake-up call in terms of the adversary that we're facing, as well as point to perhaps the growing bipartisan call for getting more aggressive on countering the Chinese Communist Party in the House of Representatives. But he did not do that. Hugh, assume for a second that this thing, let's just say it had absolutely no intelligence collection value. Let's just say it was pretty useless. Well, it's still a massive middle finger to the United States. I mean, it still seems like a message deliberately timed to coincide with Secretary Blinken's visit to us that, hey, look what we can get away with, and you'll do nothing about it. And this is right in their playbook, right? I remember when Blinken went to meet with Chinese officials in Alaska, and they embarrassed him.
They yelled at him.
Go back to Obama at the G20 in Hangzhou, where they refused to get the staircase on Air Force One right, and they sent Chinese fishing vessels to contest the Scarborough Shoal simultaneously with his visit. Go back all the way to 1958, when Mao humiliates Khrushchev. When the Soviet Union is at the height of their power post-Sputnik, Khrushchev comes to China, and Mao asks him if he wants to go swimming, knowing full well that Khrushchev can't swim, and Mao's a very good swimmer. He puts him in unair-conditioned rooms. I mean, this is right in the Chinese Communist Party playbook. I guess it's possible that it was unintentional. It was a rogue.
We don't have to cover that base.
Seems like it's a hell.
Can you imagine what the after-action discussion with Xi Jinping, and Pompeo named last night a couple of his senior advisors. He called him dead-eyed. The scariest guy he's met is Xi Jinping because he's got no emotion, completely blank, totalitarian look. Can you imagine the conference room debrief of our reaction and what they must be saying about us? And then they add in the State of the Union last night when they, like us, were expecting the president to say something. It's like Ike not saying anything after Sputnik, or Kennedy not saying anything after the Cuban Missile Crisis, or FDR not noticing. It's not American lives weren't lost, but it's an amazing moment in American foreign policy. And the president was silent before the Congress 2 days later.
And now, because the past is prologue, we also have a growing missile gap with China. We have an ICBM gap, an intercontinental ballistic missile gap. They've made incredible advances in their nuclear technology. So across the board, they're on the march. And so I really was expecting more out of the president. And, they seem trapped in this framework of, well, we have to cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to climate change. I mean, has the CCP shown any interest in doing right by the environment or the climate? I mean, do these people honestly think Xi Jinping cares about any commitment made at COP27? It's a profoundly utopian and naive view of the world that misunderstands Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party priorities.
Chairman, I want to close with this. Much of the American domestic left would rather fight with Republicans because Republicans are not dangerous. They don't even use nasty words most of the time, much less push back. They might go to a school board meeting and get mad if their kids have been assaulted at school, but it's pretty easy to attack Republicans on the national news media. They don't want to get into a fight with the Chinese. I believe appeasers are going to appease because they're afraid. What do you think?
Well, there is this fear of provocation that you see playing out in Ukraine that accounts for a lot of our half measures. It's every step we take is dangerous because it's too provocative. I would argue that weakness is provocative. Weakness is what invites war. And so what we need to do in Taiwan is put in place a posture of deterrence by denial that forces Xi Jinping to think twice. This, as I've said on your program before, is the paradox of deterrence. In order to prevent war, you need to convince the adversary that you're willing to go to war.
Have you got a hearing set up yet for the new select committee? Is there staff on board? Is it finally, you got the members? Are you getting organized?
We do. I'm about to leave this interview and go right into our first all-member meeting. And then when I am ready to announce our first hearing, which is tentatively scheduled, as well as our first few events, you'll be the first to know, Hugh. But we are going to be ready to sprint after we get our rules passed, and that's going to happen all in the coming weeks.
Look, I don't like to beat up on Disney, but I do. Yesterday, they announced they're cutting out a portion of the South Park that mentioned Chinese labor camps so it can be shown in Beijing. You might want to bring that up with your Democrat friends this morning. Please extend them an offer to come on the show as well, Mr. Chairman. No Wisconsin bashing this morning was unnecessary. Chairman Mike Gallagher, thank you for joining me.